we have Professor Richard Boyatzis. Professor Boyatzis is an expert in emotional intelligence. He's an author of several books on emotional intelligence, including this wonderful book, international bestseller, Primal Leadership, which is co-authored by Daniel Goleman and Annie McKee. Professor Boyatzis, thank you very much for joining us today.
Great to be with you.
Professor Boyatzis, so the topic of today is emotional intelligence in a kind of project management environment. Now, first of all, what is emotional intelligence and how can we apply it in a project management environment? How can project managers utilize emotional intelligence to be more effective in their leadership?
Right. Well, first, emotional intelligence is the awareness and management of your own emotions and of the emotions of others. So it really has to do with how do you handle yourself and how do you handle your relationships. Mm-hmm. Secondly, empirical studies, competency studies of effective versus ineffective project managers have shown, like they've shown in every study of any management leadership position, that the emotional and social intelligence behaviors or competencies account for about 40 to 60% of the effectiveness of a project manager. So while a lot of project managers think technical expertise is really important, technical expertise gets you to be average. It allows you to be mediocre as a project manager. And if you know a lot of other project management functions like staffing and scheduling and all of the operations issues, Gantt charting and PERT charting and all that stuff, that will also get you to be mediocre. But none of those things in the empirical research differentiate the outstanding or effective project managers from the average ones. Mm-hmm. What does, most of the variance are these things that we call emotional and social intelligence. And they really have to do with, at the personal side, things like emotional self-control, emotional self-awareness, adaptability, achievement orientation, positive outlook. On the social side, empathy, teamwork, influence, inspirational leadership, and such. Now, in the research on effectiveness, that data is pretty clear. When you look at why it's so clear, and in mine and my colleagues, as well as some others, looking at neurological evidence, it's very clear because emotions precede kind of analytic thoughts in the human mind. Precede in the sense of your emotions are aroused in any moment in 8 to 40 milliseconds. You're not going to have a cognitive event in the sense of a thought in the neocortex for beyond 40 milliseconds, probably, somewhere into a half or a quarter of a second. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That means that your emotions almost always precede your thoughts. Right. Now, for those people who are very technically oriented, and a lot of project managers are former engineers. As a former engineer myself, I don't know how much you know, but I got my first degree in aeronautics and astronautics at MIT.
Yes, I
worked in the aerospace field. And believe me, that kind of approach to engineering and spending a lot of time with folks like that is something that I have all my life. And the more technical you are, the more you emphasize a neural network that's kind of based in the executive function called the task positive network. The problem is that the task positive network, it suppresses the default mode network, this part of the other part of the network in the brain that goes deep and the surface, that allows you to be open to other people, to new ideas, to moral concerns. So when you start to look at the empirical evidence of what really distinguishes an outstanding and effective project manager, it's not making budget. It's not doing things according to plan. It's not even getting a lot of metrics and analytics. All of that typically gets you to be mediocre. In other words, those things differentiate the poor from the average. But the effective ones who are above the average, the outstanding ones, do these other things. And it makes sense. You're not managing a project of science or engineering. You're managing people who are doing the project.
Absolutely.
So unless you're managing the people effectively, unless you're leading and inspiring them, not much is going to happen.
Exactly. I mean, you're not, as you said, you're not managing processes. It's people that get things done, right? So it's absolutely makes sense to learn how to manage, how to lead people, inspire people to, and motivate people rather than. And now, in your book, there are different styles of leadership. There is the commanding and pace setting, but there's also the visionary, the coaching style, and so on. And there is some emphasis that the pace setting and commanding style needs to be used very cautiously, whereas there should be more.
Let me be a little more bold with that. I mean, in the book, Dan, when we were writing it, said, look, if we really want to sell books all over the world, we can't insult people who, because many of them are into the command and control stuff, which never works. It's never worked. It didn't work in the 50s. It doesn't work in the military. I spent 17 years doing leadership research with others, and some of my doctoral students still do, in the military, in the U.S. and the U.K. One colleague at Ehssan Sakhaee does with the Israeli Air Force. I can assure you that effective military leaders do not use command and control. So you start to say, when, if ever, is the commanding style really useful? Hardly ever.
Hardly ever.
Hardly ever. I mean, sometimes people say, well, what about the fire chief in a fire? You don't want to sit around and talk about it. That's fine. We had a very unfortunate shooting incident at my school 11 years ago, and I got out of the 114 hostages. I got out in the first hour, and so I went and helped the commander of the SWAT teams go in and get the guy, which took about 6 hours. Fortunately, no one was shot after the first 15 or 20 minutes. One person sadly did die, but when they had 4 SWAT teams. We have a very complicated building. It was designed by Frank Gehry, so everything is twists and turns and, 5 floors and a basement. The commander of these 4 SWAT teams moving in and clearing out sections of the building, getting the hostages out to safety, and then moving the guy up and up and up till they cornered him in this one conference room and then got him out without killing him. He never raised his voice. I never heard him issue a command. He was perpetually asking questions. So if even in a crisis, an effective leader asks questions, the whole idea of the commanding style as being justified in a crisis, I think, is a way to make people who use it feel a little better. But chances are it's hardly ever going to be useful. Now, pace setting is a little different story. Pace setting becomes useful in those situations. There are a couple of characteristics. One, if everybody who's working on the team is a really top performer, so you don't have any developmental issues, and they're all very experienced, the pace setting, I'm going to do it, you follow my lead, can work very easily. But in most situations, your team membership has a different composition. And when you use pace setting, it leaves a lot of people behind. A lot of people have claimed that the pace setting style, in basketball, when somebody is a player and a coach, it confuses people. And I think one of the things it does is it confuses the individual themselves. Am I trying to make a basket or am I trying to get the team to work together? So on those kinds of things, and in technical issues, when you're managing projects, the seduction is always, am I trying to solve the problem, which is the individual contributor, or am I trying to get the team to solve the problem? And the answer for a project manager is most of the time the latter. I'm trying to get the team to solve the problem. Sometimes, if the project manager has some expertise and isn't totally in the management role, he or she may be able to use the pace setting style. But it's the kind of thing that we actually claim is almost a non-management style.
And so, I much like yourself come from an engineering background. I did computer engineering. I did a PhD in telecommunications. So I'm quite familiar with how technical people kind of have, as you said, the prefrontal.
So how did you end up becoming such a nice, presentable person?
Oh, that's very kind of you. Likewise yourself. And that's what kind of pushed me away from engineering, and right now I don't actually do any engineering. I've got research students who are working on motivational psychology and positive psychology and emotional intelligence,
right.
which is something I felt was lacking in this area.
Yeah.
And I'm still with the Faculty of Engineering, but
look, I do a lot of work with my engineering colleagues in the School of Engineering, and I taught a course on complexity theory in our School of Engineering a few years ago, co-taught. But here's an example, and perhaps the best exploration of this is in my MOOC, which I would encourage you and your students to take.
I have.
I mean, okay, good. Encourage them to take it. As you know, the price is right. It's free.
Yes.
It's available. The third run of Inspiring Leadership Through Emotional Intelligence will start May 5th on Coursera. But if they wanted to work on the videos but use the discussions with each other, in other words, they don't have to wait for the Coursera course, it's available on iTunes University.
Right, okay.
Also
I didn't
free.
know that. Okay, fantastic.
And that enables your students to do it now and then have their own discussions, watch the videos, do the individual exercises, and then have their own discussions about the ideas. But in class 8, I think it is, module 8.2 or 8.3, I start to talk about how do we get inspired leadership and participation, engagement in teams. And I use an example. I devote one of my videos and most of the module to why have the Rolling Stones continued to perform so well for 54 years, and the Beatles basically lasted 7 years, when they launched out of Hamburg. And I think an awful lot of it has to do with a number of factors. One of them ends up being, what's the initial vision? What's our sense of purpose, not the goals? And as engineers, we have a tendency to zero in on goals. When in fact, the more important issue for people, and now we have neurological evidence, is to say, what's the purpose? What's the reason we're doing this? And if you remember the purpose, serving a particular client need, helping invent something, saving people's lives, whatever the sense of purpose is, ends up being profound. The fact that the Rolling Stones started with a purpose of playing music together meant that as long as they could play together, they had the juice. The Beatles started by wanting to create new music, which worked fine, but when they wanted to create different kinds of music, the group imploded. A second characteristic is, in any team, project team or otherwise, you need emotional glue. And the goals are not enough. The goals are very, what I call, transactional. And we had a paper that was just published in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience. I don't know if you've seen that. Just came out about a month ago.
No, but I'd like to check that out.
Okay, again, Frontiers in Human Neuroscience is free. And our paper with Tony Jack and Kylie Rochford looks at how these two antagonistic networks in the brain have explained, or do explain, why for empirical research since the 1940s, people have said teams, as well as organizations and countries, need a task leader and an emotional leader or relationship leader. Or they say you need somebody who acts like a father and somebody who acts like a mother. COXO, CEO, COO. All these notions, but the idea is that these roles are split and they're orthogonal. Well, we explain that the reason these things keep happening is these are two antagonistic networks in your brain, and effective leaders need both. So the challenge is, how do you approach that when you're an engineer and you love engineering and you love figuring things out, you're always kind of taking things apart, you're always going to gravitate towards the task positive network. But the problem is that inhibits you're noticing new things. You're thinking about moral concerns. I don't mean moralizing of right and wrong, but I mean, is this fair and just? Which a lot of us have contended was an important gap in our science and engineering education. But the fact is that the most effective leaders blend these two different types of roles. In a project team, you need different things covered. Now, one of the things that often happens, and you see this the most clearly on sports teams, but I think it works in families and it works in project teams, which are kind of the elemental units when we come together to do something. When I'd say music groups would be the other elemental unit, is that you need somebody who's an emotional glue, somebody who people can talk to, somebody who can help monitor the emotional mood of the group. And again, I would contend that the Beatles lost that when Brian Epstein died. Rolling Stones had it when Ronnie Woods joined the band. And he became one of the musicians in the early 70s. He is that person. But if you look at any great sports team, any sports team that wins 1, 2, or 3 major events, there's always somebody that performs that emotional glue. Sometimes it's the formal team captain, Larry Bird on the Boston Celtics in the 90s. But other times it's not. So when the Chicago Bears U.S. football team won the Super Bowl in 1986, a friend of mine was the president, that's how I knew a lot of the details. Walter Payton and Mike Singletary, who were not the quarterback, were the emotional glue. So this raises questions about, how do you manage the effort? Now, what we're saying in this new article is, in the best of all possible worlds, the project leaders would be trained in how to handle the relationships and the emotions as well as the tasks. But that's hard. And until we get to the point where we teach emotional intelligence and leadership behavior, not just about leadership, but teach the behavior in engineering programs, we're not going to get there. And because a lot of people who go into engineering are going to see that as soft shit, it's the garbage of, I don't want to deal with people, I just want to deal with the problems. The dilemma is, unfortunately, I think the emotional and social intelligence are the hard skills. People can be taught to do PERT charting and do kind of multiple causal analysis, like people can be taught financial management. It's very hard. You can teach emotional and social skills, competencies, but it takes longer to learn them, as you're very aware of personally because you've lived it.
Absolutely, and it's true. It's we teach about leadership and so on, and I try to not be so much focused on the theories and more on the practice of leadership.
Right. Yeah. That's really important. That's really important because when you study leadership, you activate the analytic network.
Correct.
It doesn't really help.
It's just, you're learning theories like any other theory, right? And it's like you're not actually even being able to apply that theory because it's just, as you said, it's there. Sometimes, so for instance, one of the current projects is to actually, the project is about getting everything done in the team, and then a part of the project is how do you manage conflict within your team?
Right.
How do you come up with ideas, and how do you prioritize, and but at the same time, how do you actually manage conflict, negotiate with your team members, and so on, and then reflect on it, because that becomes more of an applied thing. So it's not just a project and try to kind of work on a project, and then if there's a problem, and I say, don't come to me, try to resolve it yourself, because that's actually applied leadership. So,
but people need some tips or some guidance in how to do that.
Absolutely.
Look, one of my colleagues, Vanessa Druskett, who used to be at Case Western Reserve, now she's at the University of New Hampshire, is one of the world's leading authorities on emotional intelligence in teams. And she reiterates findings of other people who have spent a lot of time, Connie Gersick, Richard Hackman, others, Ruth Wagman, studying these kind of graduate student teams, project teams, MBA teams, and others. And as far as I know, every engineering project runs into the same things. That in student teams, and Vanessa did a longitudinal study where she looked at how the teams were dealing with each other. These are 28-year-old MBAs. And then she looked at how they performed the following semester in that team. And the norms of the team that helped to predict the best grades the next semester, which she called performance, were on the whole different than the norms that produce the most learning. So here's the classic issue. And I'm supporting what you just said, is that the two things that almost always get in the way of student project teams are how to handle differences of opinions, which if you frame it as conflict, you're already down a negative path, and how to handle unequal contributions, or what's often called the freeloading problem.
Absolutely, yes.
One of the things that Vanessa showed was that teams that got the best grades divided up the work, had people do different pieces, and then it was all put together by one person. So they minimized contact. Now, that's not really teamwork.
No.
And so what they did was they avoided confronting or dealing with any of that stuff. And because the one person pulled it together, he or she made up for any uneven contributions. The teams that learned the most about the content as well as teams confronted each other when there was a difference of opinion and addressed the issue of fairness or distribution of workload. So, and I think most of us need some practice in that. That's why I think team building exercises are a good one, especially for groups that are more technically oriented.
Absolutely.
Or analytic, IT, accounting, finance, engineering. I mean, in medicine, the people we worry about are the surgeons and the radiologists and the pathologists, because they actually end up being socialized into thinking they don't really have to deal with people.
Absolutely.
So one of the issues is, if you don't think about conflict as how do I manage the conflict, but how do I create voice? How do I be more inclusive of diversity? And I'm going beyond diversity of gender and race and ethnicity. I'm talking about diversity of thought. So do we create a setting in which people can talk about different ways to go about it? Now, obviously, the tension there is if you sit and talk about the different ways to go about it, how do we get something done? That's the dialectical tension. You have to have a sufficient amount of conversation that everybody thinks they're being heard and diverse opinions are heard, but then you also want to move ahead. One of my colleagues, Dave Hoffman, a senior faculty member in organizational behavior at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, was on the commission in the U.S. that the U.S. government formed to look at what happened with the Deepwater Horizon, that horrible blowout that happened in the Louisiana, in the Gulf of Mexico, where the oil rig went on fire and burned for, 100 days or something, and, millions of gallons went into the Gulf of Mexico. Horrendous, not just ecological event. He was able to document in the conversations, and I actually read this even in some of the Wall Street Journal's detailed conversations that they established after the fact. The chief engineer on the rig went to one of their management meetings and went to the head of the rig, on the rig itself, and said, we're seeing some pieces of rubber get kicked out of the pumping mechanism, and they're floating to the surface. That shouldn't be happening. They agreed, they look into it. He comes back to him and he says, I'm still seeing some of this happening. I want to shut the pump down. Let us go down there and figure out what's going wrong. The head, the person who was in charge of the whole rig said, quote, let me take it to corporate and see what they want us to do. If he had listened to this dissenting voice, because the other people said, oh, let's keep going. If he had listened to that dissenting voice, they might have lost 2 days of production, but they would have saved 140, 150 days of being shut down. And billions of dollars. Absolutely. Not to mention the ecological hazard. So, I think it's an example. I'm not saying that every time somebody with a dissenting opinion is right, but if we don't listen to them, we will not be open to new ideas.
Absolutely.
So I see the major benefit for conversation, for diversity, is diversity of thought to help us figure out whether or not there are other problems going on or there are alternate solutions. That's an example of technique.
Absolutely. And one of the things that kind of stuck in my mind from the book was, spending, like for instance, managers spending some time actually building relationships with their subordinates.
Right.
And how much more it gives back in time in the future. So it's some initial investment of building that relationship. Of course, it's overhead. It might be seen as overhead, but it could
right. For everybody coming out of science or engineering, the same applies to their intimate relationships, their boyfriends, girlfriends, their marriages.
Absolutely.
If they don't spend time investing in building the relationship, they'll be lonely.
Yeah, absolutely. That's often what happens with engineers and scientists.
That's right. No, and you see, the analogy is the dynamics are the same. You think of a sports team. I mean, many of us have either played on sports teams or played in bands. It's two very common things now, increasingly for women as well as for men. And nobody has ever done that and had success, either in the sports team or in the band and the music, without building a relationship where people spend time getting to know each other, getting to understand each other, getting to know how to motivate each other. And that ends up being the basis for a shared identity, a shared vision. I teach a course on teams for our executive MBAs. These are folks usually in their 40s, early 40s. And one of the things I have them do as the major project in the course is I outline different types of teams, from management teams to sports teams to explorer teams to R&D teams, etc. And I have them pick in one type of team. I have them pick a team that has done really well over time consistently and improved, and another team that keeps sliding. So one did the Ukrainian spelunking team that went to the lowest point in the earth in their cave diving and came back and no one died, versus a US-based team that tried the same thing 3 times and they've lost some lives and they never reached the bottom. One looked at an adventure team of Eric, I think his name was Eisenhower, something like that. He was blind, a mountain climber who led a team of 22 people to the summit of Everest. 19 of them made it to the summit. All 22 came down alive. Compared to adventure consultants who had a lot of very fit but very wealthy industrialists who bought in, they hit some bad weather, they kept pushing because their objective was to get to the summit, and I believe 7 of them died. And they never made it to the summit. Then they also look at sports teams. Now, prior to the last 3 years, when Pepe Guardiola moved to Bayer in Munich, he was the head coach of Barça. And the Barcelona football team, World Association Football, has their arch rival Real Madrid. And I loved it because for a period of almost 20 years, Real Madrid spent 5 times the amount of money on their players that Barça did. And Barça had 17 victories compared to, I think, Real Madrid's 6. Whether it was in the Champions League or, World Cup doesn't count because everybody goes back to their countries. But the Europe League or the La Liga, the Spanish League, etc. Yeah. So I would say, again, it's this dynamic you see about when people come together on a team, their resource is the talent of the individuals and then the multiplicative talent that they have when they're interacting. So if you have a bunch of individuals and that's all of the resources you have to bear on a project, like everybody's sitting in their cubicle and nobody's interacting, you're underutilizing the talent. You're getting the sum of the individual's talent. But if you can work the team as a team, you're going to get that in really what's called the Taylor series.
Right.
It's almost an exponential relationship.
Absolutely, absolutely. And
are these things you wanted to cover?
Yes. Just so in terms of practicality, I think what are some practical tips like project managers can use to to enhance, because I think it's basically.
By the way, did you see my chapter on the competencies of project managers?
I might have missed that one, which I need to go back to. Yes,
it's on a handbook of project management, and if you don't have it, email me. I'll send you a PDF copy of it. We did it looking at project teams at NASA.
Uh-huh.
A number of years ago, it came out. But it's a way to look at a piece of empirical data on it. I also have a couple papers on helping to build teams through intentional change theory, which is using the emotional and social intelligence. Again, one is in a Manfred Ketevries edited book of Laura Guillen and some others. Again, if you don't have it, I'd be glad to send it to you.
Much
practical tips. First, when you're first meeting with the team, you need to spend some time asking the question, why are we doing this? Now, why are we doing it is more than what are we trying to do? See, most of the time when people come together and say, okay, what are our objectives? In 6 months we want to have this. But they don't take the time to step back and to say, why is that important? What's the purpose?
Absolutely.
So one of the things that really helps is to spend some time, and you don't have to go overboard. If you're coming together as a project team and you have a 6-month project, it's worth an hour to talk about purpose. Because periodically in the process, you want to come back to that. And you want to say, this way we're treating each other, is this consistent with our purpose? This result, is this really the quality we want for our purpose, not just for the objectives? Okay, so spend some time early talking about purpose. In a sense, that becomes your vision. And when you do that, you want to be free to dream. Like, if this worked out really well, this were almost ideal, what would it be like? And again, the more engineering focused you are, the more you're going to say, well, that's silly. That's dreaming. But that's the point. Because it turns out when you dream, you get access to a different part of your neural network. And it's the part of your neural network that allows you to see new things. Again, you don't have to do everything with it, but that's one. Then you say something about that implications, or you then go on to say, okay, then what are our objectives? In a sense, what's our strategic and tactical objectives? And how do we want to operate as a team? How do I want to feel about you and our time together? So a group comes up in their own language with some set of norms. Then, every time the group comes together, you spend a little bit of time up front. And here's a ratio. If you're coming together for a 1-hour meeting, invest 5 or 10 minutes on either reviewing the vision or the goals or the norms, how we want to deal with each other, or all three. But you don't do it by the leader saying them. You do it by a little bit of conversation. Some of the most effective ways to do that is to have the group process an experience they just had. Last week or 2 weeks ago, this issue came up. I thought we really worked well together. We did this. It came together on this. This was very consistent with how we want to treat each other. So reviewing real episodes is good. It's better if the episodes are ones that worked.
Right.
In other words, this isn't just a game. It has to do with what part of your brain you activate. If you try to review first episodes that didn't work, everyone goes into a defensive mode in their brain, and they actually start to close down.
Right.
So you start with the things that worked, the story. Again, 5 to 10 minutes out of any 60-minute meeting. And if you're getting together for a 3-hour meeting, devote 30 minutes to this kind of chat. Then you can go in and say, okay, now this problem happened last week. What do we do about it? Because literally now we're showing that you put people in a different mental framework. And I'm not talking about some gushy stuff. We now have neurological evidence to show how that link occurs.
So whether we're dealing with technical people, project managers, this way, first of all, connects the team together. There's a shared vision.
Now, if they're robots or androids, it's a different issue.
Yes.
But if they're human, and if they have Asperger's syndrome or some form of autism, they have a problem with some of these neural networks. But other than that, which is a small percentage, it really is important. A second major thing to do, especially if the team is going to last longer than a few months, if you're on a project that's going to last several years or a year, you really want to work on the team's identity. Now, sometimes people do that by having some social events. Sometimes they do it by having some symbols, like we come up with a mascot or we all get ball caps. I mean, those are ways to manage the symbols of the identity. But you want to make sure there's an identity. Who are we as a team?
So is it good for...
shared vision, shared identity, shared positive relationships are the three ingredients that you need to have a very effective team.
Right.
And they're very practical.
And it's perfect because now they're actually going to start on a group project. So it's the timing was perfect for getting that advice from you. So, and in terms of, would we have time for one more?
Yes, I would suggest that you as the faculty member put a little encouragement in there, because we know that people are going, especially people from engineering backgrounds, will seek the most time-efficient method, which is not necessarily the most effective method. Time sometimes interferes with the ultimate performance or innovation. Look at Apple in the last 15 years. There are a lot of times they have pushed things and held things back till they got it just right. And then, boom, it creates a new phenomenon where all of a sudden we all need smartphones. Who knew?
Absolutely.
I would suggest that you actually require them to submit 2-3 page commentary early after their first meeting, and depending upon how long the project is, if the project goes a semester, 3 or 4 months, I'd say you might ask for what I call a process report once a month. So they have one after their first meeting on what is our shared vision. What did we talk about in terms of our desired norms? And at the end of each month, they submit a 2 to 3 page, what kind of norms are we using? How are we relating to each other? Are we talking about the vision? Are we taking care of each other? And it's a way to keep it in their memory, keep it in their consciousness. And it's also a way for you to figure out, look, I don't know how many teams you have.
We've got 8 teams of around 5 people right now.
Okay. Out of 8 teams, just statistically, one of them is going to implode. You're going to have problems behaviorally with one of them, where somebody hates somebody else and somebody has said something nasty about them. And now these are virtual teams, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So you don't have worried about them stealing each other's girlfriends or boyfriends or something. I mean, if they were physical teams, you'd worry about that as well. But what's going to happen is you as the faculty member also need to notice the teams that are doing well along this process, this emotional social process, and acknowledge that. Reward it. Don't ignore it. Don't leave well enough alone. It's worth noting it and congratulating them. And then if you see a team starting to go off, the earlier you catch it, the less rehab you have to do later. Because once people start severe arguments, it's very hard to bring them back.
So it's good to intervene and perhaps try to talk to the team and try to resolve that issue early on.
Yeah, the same way you and I would around the technical parts of what they're doing. If you see them taking an approach that isn't going to make sense, now they don't see it, but you know that 3 steps later they're going to run into this kind of limit on the function they're doing. You'd intervene and say, I'd like you to reconsider this. There's some different alternatives, technically. You're going to do the same thing in terms of the process and their relationships.
Absolutely.
Now, when I say relationship, I don't mean that they all have to start every meeting hugging or, locking arms and singing Kumbaya or something like that. But think about yourself. And actually, this isn't a bad exercise to use in class. Think about a team that you were a part of that did really well, that went beyond the objectives, that you felt really proud to be a part of. And then think about a team you were on that you wished had disappeared. You couldn't wait for it to be over. And ask them to talk about the differences in how those two teams functioned and felt. They will provide you with a bunch of the raw material for what you and I are just talking about.
Absolutely. And it's so important because what you mentioned as the shared vision and the identity of the group it's really the team feeling as one, not separate individuals being there just to get something done.
That's right. Otherwise, it's a collection of individuals, and then you don't have a team.
Exactly. It's just a collection of individuals. Whereas if there is an identity, there is a shared vision, they just feel as just one thing rather than separate. And that's really an example.
Here's another derailer. The more technical you are, the more you're likely to see things as transactions. Well, if I do this, then you'll do that. Exchanges, those kinds of things. That actually hurts. Because when you get into a transaction, are you married?
No, not yet.
No. Do you have any long-term relationship?
At the moment, no.
Okay, so maybe you're not a good example of this.
I'm not a good example.
If somebody has a long-term relationship, one that's feeling good and working well, and they would characterize their relationship as loving, one of the things you'll find is they stay on top of what's happening. And they don't say, okay, I'll take out the garbage if you walk the dog. They don't put everything onto an exchange or a transactional approach. I'm doing some things for you. I bought you these flowers. I bought you this print. I bought you this app just because I thought you'd love it. That's called in leadership work transformational style, where you're caring for each other, you're doing things for the good of the group or the couple or the team, and you're not always looking for something directly behind it or an exchange. That, not putting everything on the transaction. Now, sometimes the transaction helps, but it's way overplayed, especially with technical teams. So that's a thing to watch out for.
Now, in terms of actually moving towards that kind of transformational state, is it more that individuals need to kind of start looking at self-leadership? And I know you also do some work on mindfulness. And actually, generally, when I have my leadership courses, the first week is about what's the difference between leadership and management and so on. But the second week, it's about actually self-leadership and self-management, because it's, okay, what am I about? How do I manage myself? Looking at...
Whether you do it through Coursera on iTunes U, if you look at the modules in class 1, 2, and 3, they'll talk about what's resonant leadership versus dissonant. What's the difference between stress and renewal, stress being the usual contributor to dissonant leadership, and then what about emotional and social intelligence. Those are the first 3 weeks, if you will. Each one has 3 modules in it. In Coursera, it's the 8th week. On the iTunes, it's the 7th week. I talk about how does this work in teams and organizations. So, it could be the kind of thing where you might have people start to look at the videos out of order.
Absolutely. And in terms of mindfulness, what are some techniques like leaders can use to become more mindful? Or, there are 2 elements of emotional intelligence. I guess it's understanding one's own emotions and also understanding emotions of others.
And mindfulness has those 2 dimensions. I would add a third. I would say mindfulness as an ability or a state is, one, you're tuned into what's happening inside. You know when you're feeling uneasy. And because you broadcast this stuff very fast, very unconsciously, you better know. because it's going to affect everybody around you.
Mm-hmm.
So one is, are you tuned into yourself? The second is, are you tuned into the other people? Do you know when the team comes together, whether or not everybody's tired, they're pissed off, they're angry, whatever, or they're really rested and eager? And the third ends up being the natural environment or the broader environment. Are you tuned into what's happening around? I think mindfulness has all three of those things. Mm. Now, there are people who suggest you should always start with the self. I actually am a little pragmatic. I don't think you always have to start with the self. I think you should cover it. And I think for some people that seems too narcissistic. It violates certain values, and especially if you're from Australia or New Zealand, you don't want to be that narcissistic as a culture. So sometimes you can start with tuning into others. How are other people in the team feeling? Now we have in both Resonant Leadership, the 2005 book that followed Primal Leadership, and the 2008 workbook, Becoming a Resonant Leader, we have a number of exercises in there for things that people can do in practicing tuning into others in teams.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic.
It's not magical. A lot of it has to do with paying attention to how others are doing, how they're feeling.
That's, I think, thank you for this time. And I think there's a lot that students can actually do from this video, that, maybe watching some of the videos as well on iTunes.
Right.
They may have some questions, so if that's okay, I can forward that to your email in the future.
Sure, as long as you don't start asking me to teach the class.
No, we're already very grateful to have this interview.
I'm glad to help out here and there.
No,
right.
it's our privilege, and thank you again, Professor Boyatzis. And
okay, let you go to bed now.
Yeah, I strongly, I'm just going to show this book again. Because I'm still just kind of finishing it off, but hopefully we can keep in touch and hear more from you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your initiative and getting in touch.
Thank you, Prof.
Good luck.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.